Good. Okay, excellent. Well, it is a Thursday afternoon, and we are preparing to take Mission Church through Revelation chapter 1, 2, and 3, give us some specific teaching around John's words to these 7 churches in Asia Minor. And we have Dr. Brian K. Blount with us, who has written a commentary on Revelation, has also written another work on African American readings and around Revelation, and also is a editor and contributor to the African American New Testament commentary. He has vast pastoral experience and presently serves as the president of Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. And we're grateful that he just carved out a little bit of time for us to ask him some questions about Revelation. So Dr. Blount, thank you again for being with us.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here, and I am always delighted to be asked to talk about the book of Revelation.
Indeed, indeed. Okay, well, we can dive right in. I don't want to start on a negative note, and so I guess my first question is a twofold question. What are some unhelpful ways of reading Revelation? And then I would love for you to follow up with some helpful ways for us to engage reading Revelation.
Well, I think the most unhelpful way to read the book is to read it as though it was written in code for people in the 20th or the 21st century now. So, in other words, trying to decipher the numerology, because there is numerology in the book, to try to decipher the prophetic meanings and intentions as though they were written for us. So, to try to decode things. For example, when I was a pastor at Carver Memorial Presbyterian Church in Newport News, I remember someone coming into my office and saying, well, isn't the beast from the sea 666? Isn't that Russia? And why isn't it Russia? Or could it be a particular person whose first name has 6 letters, middle name is 6 letters, and last name is 6 letters? And there actually was a president at that point who fit that bill. And I said, well, you really can't understand the book to be having been written for us in a direct way. John is writing it to the people in those churches in Asia Minor at the end of the 1st century who are following Christ and are trying to figure out and understand how they can follow Christ in a time when they're being persecuted for following Christ. And what he says to them can have meaning for us. And that's what we want to do, is to figure out how the message to them has meaning for us across the centuries. And it's really not written in code. John wanted the Romans to understand as much as the Christ believers to understand what he was saying. Why? So that the Romans would be afraid of what God was doing when God was moving in the world to bring justice, because that justice would be justice that would hold Rome to account. So Rome needed to understand and hear and what God was doing. And so John doesn't want them coded out of the message. When he talks about the cities built on 7 hills, he knows the Romans understand that he means Rome. Everybody knows he means Rome. So it's not coded in the sense that it's only for the people of God. It's meant for the Romans as well. And it's not coded in the sense of secret messages for people in the 20th or the 21st century. It is a direct message to the people in John's 7 churches.
Yeah, no, very good, very good. That's helpful. It sounds as there is an audience in mind as John is writing, but there's also ongoing value and principles that we may be able to glean in the 20th, 21st century. But a healthy reading is going to give attention to the message to the original audience first and foremost.
That's right. That's right. And that's what I want everybody to begin to think about first. Yes, it applies to us as well. How does it apply to us? But first, we want to figure out how it applied to John's community. He is writing a letter in the same way that Paul wrote letters to the Corinthians, to the church at Ephesus, to the church at Philippi, to the church at Rome. He's writing a letter to these 7 churches. So we need to understand what he's trying to tell those 7 churches first.
Excellent, excellent. You mentioned the theme of persecution and oppression. I've read various different authors. Some say it was less than some suggest. Some say that this oppression and this persecution was great. I'd love to hear how you read sort of that background and that backdrop of persecution and oppression.
Well, and that's a great question, and it's one of the most important questions in terms of the context and background for understanding what's happening in the book. I grew up in Sunday school thinking that all of the Christians were being persecuted all of the time when John was writing, that there was systematic persecution. The Romans were hunting Christians down. We know there was a time when they did that, probably around 64, when there was this great fire in Rome, and the Emperor Nero blamed the Romans, and there was a systematic persecution of Christians. So I had always thought that was happening when Domitian was emperor at the time when John was writing. What we now have found out from many historians is that there wasn't a systematic persecution of Christians. As a matter of fact, there was one governor who wrote to the emperor in the area where John's 7 churches were located, and the governor asked in his letter, what should I do when somebody accuses someone of being a Christian? We're not hunting Christians down, but if someone accuses someone of being a Christian, what should I do? This is what I've been doing. I've been hauling them before a tribunal. I've been asking them whether they are Christian. And if they say no, I ask them to curse Christ, because no Christian is understood would curse Christ. If they do that, I let them go on their way. But if they persist, what I do is I will threaten them to take away their property. I'll take away their social standing. I'll exile them, as John of Patmos was exiled, or I will take their lives. I'll kill them. And the emperor writes back and says, yes, you're doing the right thing. That's what you should do. What we found out is that Christians weren't being systematically targeted. However, when someone was accused of being a Christian, or someone came out and proclaimed, on the street or in a large arena of people, whatever, if they self-testified to being a Christian, at that point, you were liable to be persecuted. Why? Because it was understood that the Christians would only give their loyalty, their worship to Christ and God, and not to an imperial force like Rome. Rome wanted to be worshipped as a deified, as a holy, sacred entity, the empire, and the emperor wanted to be recognized as a god who was born of the gods, like Apollo and Zeus, etc. If Christians were not going to worship in that way, then Christians were going to be targeted. And so if you found someone who was a Christian and they refused to worship the emperor and the empire, then that persecution would take place. But it wasn't systematic, it was targeted. And so the interesting thing then becomes, how do you as a Christian avoid being persecuted? Well, you can avoid being persecuted by not letting anybody know you're a Christian.
Amazing, amazing, interesting, and extremely helpful background information. Daniel, I know you have a few. I want to get your questions in.
I think those comments then bring to mind the idea of witness. And I was wondering if you could help us understand, maybe develop a richer understanding of how John uses the word witness in the book of Revelation. He describes, Jesus is described as the faithful witness, right? And he goes on to exhort the churches about their witness and their testimony. So in light of that context, which you just laid out, what new meaning or depth of meaning does witness help us see and understand?
Yeah, that's another very important question. You will recall that Jesus is most often known from the book of Revelation as the Lamb of God, right? That in chapter 5, he's identified as the Lamb who's sitting sitting with the Holy One on the throne. Before Jesus is ever identified as the Lamb in the book of Revelation, he's identified, as you've just said, Daniel, as the true and faithful witness, the one who witnesses. And what does he witness to? That's the revelation. That's the key to the revelation in the book of Revelation. He witnesses to his own lordship, that he is the one who is representing God on earth. And it is represented at his trial. You remember when the high priest asked him, "Are you the one, the Son of the Blessed?" And he says, "I am, and you'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven." That's the witness. That's the revelation that Jesus Christ is Lord. He's the faithful witness to that. He witnessed to it even unto the point where he was killed for making that witness. So that's first and foremost. Remember Jesus as the true and faithful witness. Now we're being called to do the same thing. John of Patmos witnesses to Jesus's lordship, and he's exiled because of it. Antipas in chapter 2, John lifts him up as someone who witnessed to the lordship of Jesus Christ and lost his life because of it. What John is asking all of his people to do is to emulate Jesus himself, and that is to witness that not Rome, not the Caesar, not any other Greco-Roman god or goddess, but only Christ is Lord, and that's the only person that one can give one's fidelity and worship to. So we are called to witness to that and to witness publicly to that, not in hiding, but publicly, even though we know if we witness to it publicly, what's going to happen? I'm going to be hauled before the tribunals, and I'm going to be punished, persecuted, lose status, lose property, and maybe perhaps like Antipas, even lose my life. The problem is that many of the people in his churches, instead of doing that kind of witnessing, we're finding that they're trying to blend in and look like any other Greco-Roman believer. One of the things that is happening is that the Christian believers are going, because one of the key things that John is worried about is that you have these trade guilds, like bricklayers and whatnot, who gather together and that they network together. They're Christian bricklayers as well as non-Christian bricklayers, obviously. So the Christians go with these other non-Christian bricklayers. They gather together and they network with one another. And they also ask the gods and goddesses to help the bricklaying business. So when you're in that kind of a context, Christians are kind of hiding amongst these Greek and Roman bricklayers. One of the interesting things they do in these situations, because they're worshiping these gods and goddesses, they have a meal and they serve meat at the meal. And then the question becomes, when the meal is served for the bricklayers who are worshiping these Greek and Roman gods, should the Christians eat that meat that has been sacrificed to a Roman god or goddess? If they don't, then people begin to ask, well, why aren't you eating the meal? And that's your opportunity to say, because I witness only to the lordship of Jesus Christ, or to just go ahead and eat the meat and blend in. John is concerned, and that's why he's angry with his churches, that too many of his people are blending in. They're not standing up and witnessing to the lordship of Jesus Christ. They're just looking like any other Greek or Roman bricklayer or whatever kind of artisan or tradesperson there is when they go to these guild meetings. They're not standing up and standing out. So that's when he talks about a lukewarm church like at Laodicea, where you're not hot or cold, you're just lukewarm. You're trying to blend in, you're trying to straddle the line between your own witness to your own faith, but kind of living quietly within the Greco-Roman traditions and looking like any other Greek or Roman believer. And he's angry about that. The interesting thing for me is that when John looks at his churches in the first century, he's angry with these churches because they are quiet. And why are they quiet? Well, because they're not witnessing publicly to the lordship of Jesus Christ. Because if they were witnessing publicly to the lordship of Jesus Christ, what would be happening? They'd be being persecuted, right? But they're not being persecuted because they're not witnessing. They're not standing up. They just look like any other Greco-Roman believer of gods and goddesses at the time. So John is really angry that his churches are so quiet, because being quiet means you're not testifying. You're not witnessing to the lordship of Jesus Christ. And if you're not, you're allowing people to believe that Rome and Caesar are indeed truly Lord. So he has that word witness all throughout the book. Witness, 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 witness. And if you look at it in the Greek, it is the language of martyr. And martyr does not mean martyr, someone who is dying for his faith. When John is using that word, it means exactly what it says. Someone who stands up, even in a hostile environment, and testifies that only Jesus Christ is Lord, knowing that you might even be killed for making that testimony.
Man, that's good. That's good. What it then has me curious about, from your perspective, is how you read and understand the witness of the Black church, the historic Black church, in light of America's story and the ways in which the Black church has had to be a witness to the truths of God in a hostile environment.
Well, one of the things I've done is I've written a little book. I think Charles was mentioning that at the beginning, can I get a witness reading the book of Revelation through an African-American lens? I've been trying in that book to think about just that question. And what I did was to look at the civil rights movement as kind of a parallel to what John was expecting from his people. In other words, witnessing to the equality, the humanity of African Americans in a context where you could be punished and persecuted in the 1960s and 70s for making that witness, right? Dogs set on you, fire hoses set on you, you be put in jail. Many people like Medgar Evers losing their lives because they refused to give in to the lie that African Americans were less than other human beings in this country, but witnessing to the equality and the humanity of African Americans, even though it would cost a price. So when I look at the language in the book of Revelation, there's one key. I said martyr was one key, witness. There's another key term in the Greek that John uses. It's called hupomone, and hupomone is often translated patient endurance. I translate it as nonviolent resistance because John doesn't want his people to act violently, but he does want his people to resist the idea that Rome and Caesar are Lord. Just as in the civil rights movement, civil rights leaders wanted African Americans and the rest of the country, but especially African Americans, to resist the idea that African Americans were not worthy of the same equality and humanity as every other human being in this country. So John, in pushing witness, is actually pushing a non-violent resistance to the idea that someone else or some other power is the one that holds the ability to bring salvation to humankind. It's not Rome, it's not Caesar, it is Christ. And then the civil rights movement was trying to do a similar thing in the essence of saying, resist the idea that African Americans are not equal to every other person, and resist that actively. Don't just sit back passively and wait for somebody to stand up for you, but actively resist that idea. And that's what John was trying to get his people to do. Don't sit back in these trade meetings and whatnot and just go up and eat the meat that's been sacrificed to Apollo or Zeus or to the Roman Caesar. No, say, I'm not eating it. And the reason I'm not eating it is because I only believe in the Lordship of Jesus Christ. And if I eat that, then I feel like I am really giving myself into an improper relationship with another power, and I'm not going to do that. In the same way that the civil rights leaders and followers in the 1960s and 70s were saying, we're not going to allow ourselves to buy into the idea or let you buy us into the idea that we don't deserve the same equality everybody else does. We're going to be active about resisting that. We're not going to wait for somebody else to resist on our behalf. We're going to resist on our own behalf. John is asking the same thing. It's a different thing. He wants the lordship of Jesus Christ. The civil rights leaders wanted equality of African Americans, but the goal was the same: actively resist the counter narrative because it's a wrong narrative.
This is so extremely helpful, Dr. Brown, as I hear you connect scripture with the realities of the civil rights movement. I wonder if in the 7 churches, any of John's words, maybe to one or two of the churches that you think are particularly applicable to 1960s, 1970s and civil rights movement. Is of the 7 churches, are there any of the words to one or two of those churches that are just really applicable and would be helpful for us to go back and give some special attention to thinking through that time?
Mm-hmm. I think on a negative, it's, a church like Laodicea. Don't be lukewarm. Stand up for what you believe in. Show your colors in the sense of if you're going to be red hot for the lordship of Jesus Christ or for the independence and equality of your people, well then fire out with that heat. Be hot, or let people know that this is what you're witnessing for. Don't leave it to chance. Make sure you're not being lukewarm, because as we know that Christ says to the church at Laodicea, I'll spit you out of my mouth because of the way in which you're lukewarm in that regard. So we don't want to be spit out of the mouth. We want to be one in sync with the intentions of Christ moving in our world. So the negative is that one. The positive, it wouldn't be just one church. I'd look at how the language is used at the end of each of the letters to the churches, and that is conquer. It's the verb nikao, nike, how do you conquer? You conquer by being faithful to the idea that Christ is Lord, and figuring out how we do that in our world today will be key. Civil rights movement, I think, figuring out that way, nonviolent resistance, because you are a child of God, and no child of God can be deemed inferior to other people. So there is this religious, spiritual underpinning to a social reality that you hold on to. That's how you conquer, though, by holding on to that trust. Every church that John writes to, he tells them how they can conquer. They can conquer by holding fast to their belief and their trust that they represent the movement of God in their community and in their world. And I think that applies to the church today. Hold on to the trust that we do represent how God is moving in the world today. And that's how we can conquer the many kinds of oppressions that are pushing out against us, whether they be spiritual or physical or social or political. We conquer by putting our trust in God being with us and then acting on that trust. I like to tell people that you get the language of conquest and conquering all through the chapter 2 and 3 and the letters to the 7 churches, and then you also get it in chapter 5 when the Lamb is introduced, because the Lamb conquers gold, but it precedes his resurrection, which shows and develops the conquest that is there as a part of the understanding of the resurrection. And chapter 7, John looks up into the heavens, I think it's verses 9 and following, and he sees a great multitude that no one could count. And they are the ones who conquered by washing their robes in the blood of the Lamb. That's the theme that goes all the way from the churches into the whole idea of the people who are ultimately in heaven worshiping at the throne of God. And John wants all of his churches to know that's the message for you. You can conquer too, but you don't conquer by running away from your witness. You conquer by living into your witness. So look for the conquer language when you read each one of those 7 letters.
Very good, very good. Extremely helpful, which it leads me to ask the question. So our church plant, 3-year young church plant, we've got millennials, we got Gen Z. We're ministering in the context of the Black Lives Matter generation. And so it leads me and often, so its question is twofold. How does Revelation speak to these millennials, our generation, and Gen Zers in the Black Lives Matter generation? But oftentimes, and my second question would be, I sense a pitting against the proclamation of the gospel and evangelism, desiring to see people come to know and love and cherish the Lamb. And a conviction about justice. Sometimes it seems as if these two are pitted against each other. And so I also wonder, is John helpful to us in showing that he's concerned with both the proclamation of the gospel and folks receiving Jesus as Lord, as well as concerns of justice?
Yeah, see, that's a great question. And John is indeed concerned with both. As I've already said, I mean, you've heard me say over and over again, the revelation is the lordship of Jesus Christ. So there's a spiritual recognition that's there. But that spiritual recognition, if Jesus Christ is Lord, who cannot be Lord? Rome. The political imperial force of Rome cannot be. So the spiritual declaration has a political ramification, a huge political ramification. Only Christ is the one who is Lord in human history, not just in heaven, but in human history. So that has a social and a political implication that simply can't be denied. Another thing that one looks at is in chapters like chapter 18 and whatnot, where John gives a litany of some of the concerns that he has. And one of the key concerns is that the imperial power of Rome to demand loyalty, social and political loyalty from all of its subjects. That's one. The concern about the economic power of Rome, demanding that all the other governments and peoples buy into the kind of economy Rome has established, an economy that benefits Rome because it's drawing resources to benefit the Romans, taking resources away from other people and pulling them into Rome. And he also at one point even mentions the buying and selling of human beings as part of that process. So he's very concerned with these kinds of issues. How do you get the mark of the beast? Because that's one of the symbols that's key in the book of Revelation. How do you get the mark of the beast? You get the mark of the beast by buying into the economic and political and military infrastructure or the reality or the belief that Rome is the universal power economically and politically and socially. That's how you take on the mark of the beast, by buying into that Roman propaganda and living that Roman propaganda and allowing the Romans to perpetuate that propaganda. So that social and political reality is what you're fighting against as you proclaim the Lordship of Jesus Christ. At chapter 12, verse 11, here's one of those places where he mingles the two of these things together, the spiritual and the social and the political. John says, they, the people of God, conquered him, the dragon, and the dragon is the satanic representation of evil that has possessed the empire of Rome to believe that it is Lord and that it's Caesar is Lord. So they conquer him by the blood of the Lamb, which is the spiritual part, and the word of their testimony, which is their part. In other words, as you testify against the power of Rome, you are participating with what God has done through the blood of the Lamb. So the religious and spiritual come together with the political and the social. And so, I mean, I think that's one of the beautiful things that John is doing with his whole book, and that is making us see that you can't separate the spiritual from the social. They come together, and if you're going to let them, if you're going to try to only deal with the spiritual, you're going to be crushed economically, militarily, and politically by Rome. Your spiritual witness has to have a social, political, and economic target as well. You're resisting all of that. So I might say that, we help participate with what God is doing in the world, not only by proclaiming God's lordship, but we help do it every time we testify by our words and our actions that something else is not in charge. So when we protest for the sacredness of Black life, we are also testifying to the understanding that God created all life. God created all life in the image of the Lamb. And our goal, our task, is to represent that lordship by protecting all life. And I think that's simply what John is asking.
Excellent. Amazing. Daniel, you might have one or two more on the tail end of our Q&A with Dr. Blount.
Yeah, one that comes to mind, I'm not even sure if it's I'm not sure how to phrase it, but essentially, at the time of John writing the book of Revelation, claims to lordship were often overt, right? And so the emperor was claiming to be Lord and Son of God. However, in our day and age, those claims are not as overt, right? And so in the context in which we live in, how do us as Christians discern what those claims to ultimate power are and how they contradict or work against Christ's claim as Lord? Because what's often common is, I think within, folks who've grown up in the church, we know the phrase Jesus is Lord, and that's just a thing we say as an abstract reality. And I think we, at least I can speak personally, haven't been equipped well enough to connect that claim to its real life implications and what it means and what it brings to bear against all the other claims of power that I navigate in my society. So how do we develop an eye and an ear to begin to discern what those claims of power are and how our submitting to Jesus's lordship can act against those or non-violently resist them, so to speak?
Yeah, and see, that's a great question, and it's really hard. That's a really hard question to answer. Um, I'll start by saying, by using a couple of examples. Um, I would say one of the things that's happening in the Black Lives Matter movement, as Charles had mentioned that already, is a challenge to the notion of white supremacy. That is, that one race of people are privileged in God's sight or have a sense of destiny, you know, the whole manifest destiny understanding that was a part of this country's history and heritage for such a long time and continues to be in many ways. The manifest destiny of people of the West, which tends to be people who are Caucasian in their history and racial and ethnic origins. That is the understanding of humanity at its best, and therefore privilege themselves by the way in which they construct laws, the way in which they construct economy, and the way in which they construct societies, redlining, and all these kinds of things, so that that privilege can be maintained. What that is doing is making a declaration that God did not create all people equal, that God's creation and representation of every human in God's image cannot be right, because the one human in God's image is the one that is represented by this sense of white superiority and white supremacy. So to understand that God is the Lord of all, and all are created in God's image, is a direct challenge to the sense and understanding of what white supremacy is. That gives us a sense of an alternative perspective to Christ's lordship, as opposed to a desire for a version of human lordship to take flight. That's essentially what the Romans were saying. We Romans are better than everybody else because of our empire. Caesar is better than everybody else because he's divine. White supremacy is saying a similar kind of thing. And of course, we know that African-American enslavement, African-American segregation, continuing African-American oppression is based on that image. So where you see it, you're fighting not just against people who hold to that image, you're fighting against the principality and power that possesses people to hold on to that contrary notion that God has created all people equal, and that the Lamb of God sacrificed for all people. So that's, I would start with that as one example. Another example I would use is if you confuse patriotism to a country, which is important and helpful, to worship of that country, so that what that country does, no matter what it does, it is doing right, even when it's harmful to others outside of the country or within the country. So if you cannot get to the point where you can critique your own country, because people say, well, you know, my country or nothing, love it or leave it, that kind of thing. The moment you say love it or leave it, you can't criticize it. You're saying that the highest good, the highest goal is that country. That's where patriotism has morphed into idolatry, worship of the wrong thing. Now, the question becomes, can you worship the lordship of Jesus Christ and worship the lordship of the country you live in? Can you do them both simultaneously? Well, John in Revelation would say, no, that's crazy. How could you possibly do that? That's what he's telling the Romans. That's what he's telling the Christians in Rome. You can't do it. So if you are in a position where you believe, or people tell you and you acquiesce to the idea that you can't critique your country because your country demands your worship and utter loyalty, you are in a non-revelation kind of world, and you need to witness against it, even though you may be persecuted because of it. So those are two examples, contemporary examples, I would use today. Anyone who's spouting white supremacy, or even if they're not spouting it, they're living it and allowing it to continue and to progress, is arguing against the lordship of Jesus Christ, because you can't proclaim the lordship of Christ that understands all of us to be created in God's image and Christ to have sacrificed himself for all of us, and then go on and say some people are better than other people. You can't do it. You also can't ultimately proclaim true, ultimate, total worship and lordship of a country, even the country you're born in, and at the same time proclaim the ultimate exclusive lordship of Jesus Christ. You can't do both. You got to make a decision. That doesn't mean you don't love your country or be patriotic to it, but you can't worship it. You can't give it what you can only give God. And if you do, John's got a letter to write to you.
Okay. I love everything that you are explaining to us, and it gives me a parallel thought in that John loves these churches, yet John, with humility, but also with passion and fervor and conviction, he critiques these churches. And in a similar way, if we can't have a humble posture to critique Rome and to deny its lordship, or that it is the center of God's outworking of his plan and purposes in the world, then something has gone astray, as I think you've done well to highlight for us. And so in a similar way, an application for us as we are heeding and listening and seeking to respond to what John is saying to those churches and consider its implication and application for us today is a healthy critique of where we live at the micro level, at the city level, at the regional level, the state level, and at the national level, in order that we're not lukewarm or we're trying to maintain two loves. Where that soul, love, and devotion is to be to the Lord Jesus Christ. And these things that you're sharing are so significant for us here because Mission Church, we're a multicultural church. Early in the life of our church, I would reference Revelation 7:9-10 as an anchor. And although there's a lot of people from a lot of places in the world here in Norfolk, I think it's probably more accurate for us to say that we're a biracial church. And so I'd love to hear you maybe give some encouragement, highlight some obstacles, and maybe even highlight some opportunities for the multicultural church as we're trying to exercise and practice the reconciliation that is ours in Jesus. And then for bonus, I'd love for you, historically, I have been Baptistic in my leaning. And so I'd even love to hear your voice if you might be able to recommend or give thought to. I know your history, your background, your heritage is Presbyterian. Can Baptistic believers and Presbyterian believers possibly even be joined and reconciled in a fellowship together? So opportunities, obstacles to the multicultural biracial church. And then could you imagine or even dream a body of Baptistic and probably more covenantal Presbyterian believers being united and reconciled together in one fellowship? I'd love to hear your voice on those.
Yeah, I would say, let me start with the one about the multicultural and biracial church. And I would say you should celebrate the fact that you're witnessing to the vision John has for the church in the future. I've often told people that the book of Revelation is about John seeing the future, God's future, because when he looks up in that open door in heaven in chapter 4 and he sees the throne room, he sees a picture, a glimpse of the future of God's reign and what that reign looks like. And what he said is that in the New Jerusalem, which is represented by that, the new heaven and the new earth, every tongue, tribe, nation, people are streaming into the New Jerusalem. In other words, it's multicultural, it's multiracial, it's multi-people, multi-heritage. That's what the future looks like. And if we know that's what the future looks like, our goal must be to try to figure out a way to represent that future in the present. One of the ways we can represent that future in the present is the very kind of church you're talking about there. I mean, so in that sense, I would celebrate that you're witnessing to God's future even as we live in the present. And that is a message I have shared with churches in the last several years all across this country and world, that when we gather together and there's only people here who look like us, whether that be us being white or black or people in different countries, if it's all the same, we've got work to do, because this does not represent the future. And our goal is to witness to the future in the midst of the present. And the future is Jesus's lordship, right? What we want to do is to witness to that future reality in the present. And Jesus's lordship will be over all tongues and tribes and peoples and nations. We want to represent that when we gather together to worship in the present. So one, celebrate that. That's something to celebrate. You're witnessing to something special, and that's a gift. And hopefully you can become missionaries for that gift to call others to do as you're doing. The other piece is, as I think, and I've forgotten, I think the last part of the question that you asked me. Can you repeat just
Yeah,
the end
it'd
part of the
be
question?
just, do you have any examples where of congregations, local expression of churches that under the lordship of Jesus have practiced, navigated a congregation through a clear conscience and believers who maybe believers baptism only, in
Oh
other,
yeah, I think that's right. I remember.
yeah, is that too far of a practice of reconciliation? I'd love for you to dream with me.
Yeah, if I dream with you, certainly I think it's possible, because I think it will be. I mean, that's the goal that we're moving toward in the book of Revelation. So yes, I think so. Can we practically do it in our time? There are obviously hurdles, and those hurdles. I grew up Baptist, and I am Presbyterian now, so I represent kind of that reconciliation in myself. That is, that I believe it's possible. I'm a walking, living example that it's possible that one can be Baptist and be Presbyterian. One can become Presbyterian, but celebrate and remember and feel wonderful about his Baptist heritage, even as he's living out a Presbyterian identity. So for me, I believe, yes, certainly that is possible. We're starting at Union Presbyterian Seminary, a Baptist house of studies right now. So the goal is to have Baptist sisters and brothers intermingling with Presbyterian sisters and brothers who are trying to figure out what it means to be called by God, and to then be called into a seminary to prepare and equip themselves to go out as leaders in God's church. That conversation here, I think, will have meaning for them as they go out into their Baptist and Presbyterian realities when they leave. It'll encourage a desire for reconciliation, because there's been conversation here on the campus as they've been going through their biblical studies, their theological studies, their Christian education studies, and all of these things, particularly as they study church history and see where some of these difficulties occurred, why they occurred, and whether or not we can learn from what happened in the past to help us as we think about reconciliation in the future. So yes, I think it's possible. And I think the more we have people in settings equipped for leadership, and they're in ecumenical settings, yes, I think that helps prepare us for the possibility of more vivid examples of reconciliation in the future.
Amen. Indeed, indeed, indeed. Well, Dr. Brian, thank you, thank you, thank you. I trust that this resource is going to be a blessing to anybody who presses play on it, and I pray it drives them further to deeper love for John's letter, and their love for Jesus. And so, on behalf of myself and Daniel and anyone listening on, thank you again. We appreciate your time, and are grateful for you sharing some wisdom and some thoughts with us.
Well, thank you for this invitation, and blessings to all of you out there who've been listening to us.